everyone to another video of Coding Cleverly. So today's topic we're going to be discussing about static data members and static member functions. So whenever we come across object-oriented programming, so what are basically static data members and static member functions? So let's go in a theoretical aspect and we will read a few about this, and then after that I'll explain using a programming example. Static data members are class members that are declared using the static keyword. Now understand that this keyword over here that says they are class members, and they are not object level, but they are class level. There is only one copy of the static data member in the class, even if there are many class objects. So in spite of having so many class objects, you will only have one static data member, which will be sharing its data value to every single object. The static data member is always initialized to 0 when the first class object is created. So it will have an initial value of 0 when its first object is created, and then after that it will be incremented. So we could have many use cases of this. So we could have a pictorial view of how static data members work. Is over here is that there's a class and it has 3 objects. So 1, 2, 3. So it has some kind of values, 100, 200, 300, but we will not take that as some kind of consideration. What we need to consider is this 3. Why is this 3 doing here? This is actually a static data member and it is linked to all of the objects. So static data member is 1, objects are 3, and this value is being shared by all of these 3 objects. So whenever I create another object, so for instance, if I have 4, I will have this incremented to 4. And if I have another object, it will increment to 5, 6, 7, it could go so on. So now let's have a programming example related to this. Now that I opened up my dev C++ environment, I encourage you to type along with me so that you could get the best practice. So we are going to include our IO stream, we're going to include our namespace standard, and also we're going to include our main function. And in the main function, we have the regular return 0. So that was that. Now before what I'm discussing about is that static data members and static member functions. To understand this concept, we'll take a scenario. So our scenario is we're going to create a class, and we're going to create a class which is called base class. So I'm going to name my class as base class, and also inside of it I'm going to have a public section. And inside the public section, I'll have 2 data members. One data member will be called ABC, and other will be called count. So what I'm using count for is that the concept what I'm trying to apply is the static data member. So what I'm going to do is this is going to be called a static count. I wrote my static keyword before the data type. You could also write the static keyword after the data type. It will still work and the compiler won't give any error, but in this example I'll do it before. And now this is known as a static int count. So what is static int count going to do is basically whenever I create any object 1 to this class, it will increment the value to the of count to 1. So if I create another object, it will increment to 2 or 3. If I create 7 objects, it will increment the count to 7. So how am I going to apply this is basically first I'm going to declare this inside of my class. And one important thing to notice is that static data members are class level, and static member functions are also class level. They are not object level. So they do not determine what object you create. No matter how many objects you create, the static value will always be same, and it will be shared among all of the objects. Now what I do is that I create my default constructor, and what I'm going to do a default constructor with is that I'm going to first create the base class, so it doesn't have a data type. I create a constructor and I give it no input parameters to it, and what will it do is increment the count. So how am I going to apply this thing? So the thing is over here, it's inside the scope, and it will be allowed to access the static member, these functions, and basically this is called a default constructor. Default constructor is also working as a function. So what it's going to do, it's going to be allowed to access the static member and will increment it. So now that I declared it over here in the class scope, I'm going to go outside of the class and I'm going to initialize it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it as the first base class, and then I'm going to do the scope resolution operator. Over here you can see I will access the static count. So what I'm going to do is count, and now I'm going to increment initialize it to 0, so that before having any object created, the value will be 0, and before that I will have to declare an int data type to it, so the compiler knows that I have done everything correctly over here. And because that, and other thing is that this is how static members are defined outside of the scope. So now that this is done, we're going to try to save and execute just to see if we are working so far so good. So processing, and we have no errors. Okay, great. So now that I have my class created, I'm going to test my class out in the main function. So I'm going to call my static member, which is count, and console output I'm going to say initial count. So initial count. So it will have an initial count. So I'm just going to access it by using that same class, so base class, and I'm going to use the scope resolution operator, and I'm going to use count. So I'm going to use an end line just to have a prettier output. So execute, compile, and run. You will see 0 as the initial. So here we have initial count is 0 because we didn't create any object. So now we'll create an object. So now we're going to create an object. So we're going to use our base class, and I'm going to create an object. So I'm going to say obj1. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same output. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm just going to paste this here. And now I'm going to talk about the count. So it's just basically going to increment this. So it's going to say count after one object. So after creating one object, the count changes. So how will this affect? After I'm doing this, we know that we created a default constructor. So the default constructor will be called, and it will increment the count value, and then it will increment it to 1. So after this, if I run this code, I will have 1 as my count. So you will see over here, initial count was 0 and the count after one object turned into 1. So what happens if I create two objects? So you would guess the same thing. What would happen is that it will increment once more. So I'm just going to create an object over here, object 2, and I'm just going to make this as 2. So I'm going to say count after 2 objects. So I'm going to execute, compile and run this code. And you can see over here the count changed to 2. So similarly, this will happen for more objects. So now after having insights of static data members, let's come across static member functions. So what are static member functions? Static member function is a special member function which is used to access only static data members. Any other normal data member cannot be accessed through static data members. So this is a very important point, and it says when we create static member functions, we are only allowed to access only static data members, and any other static member functions or any other functions from outside of the class. We are not allowed to use any other such members which are defined inside the class. Just like static member function is also a class function because it's defined in class level, and it does not matter in which object you're creating. So it's not based on object level, it is based on class level. It's not associated with any class object. So that's basically what we said. So here we're going to explain how we're going to use a static member function. So you know that we have an initial count and it's incremented to 2 after creating 2 objects. So what I want to do is I want to create a member function. I want to create a static member function. So I'm going to create it after my default constructor. So right after my default constructor, I'm going to use the keyword static, and I'm going to use the return type, which is int. So I'm going to call it as get count. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give no input parameters to it, and I'm going to give the return function. So I'm going to say return, and I'm going to return the value of the count. So if I return the value of the count, I will be allowed to access my static data member, which was defined in my class. So just to be sure that I'm only allowed to use count static members, I'm going to go over here as ABC. Let's check if my non-static member is also allowed to be modified or accessed to my static member function. And hopefully I won't be allowed to do it because this is an error. A compiler will throw it out and says invalid use of member base class ABC in static member function. So this is invalid because it's not a static, and it says from this location. So you can see over here, line number 19 was where my error started. So what I'm going to change it up to is my count. So I'm going to change it to count. I'm going to save this code. I'm going to try to compile and execute this. So now you will see that it's successfully run. So right now I haven't done anything with my member function. What I'm going to do now is over here, instead of using my count explicitly right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this inside private members. So I'm going to put a private section up an access specifier, and inside I'm going to paste these two functions. So I'm going to paste these two members inside of this private section. And in the public section, you could only see a constructor and only a static member function. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to access my count. But if I try to do now, you will see I will get an error that it is only private. You could see that I could get an error that says count is private. So the way I could access this is using my static member function, which is get count. So I'm using my static member function by using the scope resolution operator, and I'm just going to use the get count, and I'm going to put this. So over here, my compiler has detected that it's also a static member function, so it will be allowed to do it. So over here, I'm going to also change it to get count, and I'm just going to change it, and you can see over here it's public because I defined it in public scope, and I have it into return type of base class get count. So if I save this, execute, compile and run this, my program will run successfully, and you can see the initial count when we had no object defined was 0, and after creating 2 objects, we had an count of 2.